Wilfried is working with Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, DGAP, in Berlin. He's also associated with the University and St. Gallen University. Focusing on Russia, Ukraine, Germany, German-Russian relations, and Russian activities inside Germany, which is the core topic. By the way, he has also focused on Sudeten Germans, which is dear topic to us. But this is going to be about Russia, Germany, German-Russian relations, and Russian activities inside Germany, which we are watching from Prague, or at least some of us quite eagerly, since we do see sometimes that if Russia doesn't go directly to Czech Republic, then sometimes they go to Czech Republic via Germany, which is getting it more complicated. Thanks for Hans Seidel Stiftung, thanks for NATO Aktuál, and on behalf of Prague Center for Transatlantic Relations, I welcome here Wilfried Jilge.
I would like to begin with some premises of German foreign policy you have to understand in order to balance, to evaluate the German approach to Russia and to understand a highly ambivalent relationship between Germany and Russia. Germany is, as you know, a very important player in Eastern Europe at all, a very important economic actor, actually also when it comes to its neighbors in East Central Europe, the Visegrad states, including Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland, where the mutual economic relations also with Hungary are quite intensive from both sides. I mean, that is very important economic mutual relation. German's foreign policy is to Eastern Europe is quite influenced by the historical experience of the legacy of World War II. It was for Germany a rule that minorities, that is actually very important for Czech Republic, can not be used anymore as tools or be abused for foreign policy or even imperial aims of foreign policy. Secondly, for Germany, the keeping and preserving of rule-based order based on liberal values is quite important because Germany sees itself primarily as an export nation which depends on good economic relations and therefore depends on a quite friendly framework on rules of law, good governance. Therefore, Germany is very engaged in the reform processes in the Eastern Partnership. For example, as you know, in Ukraine, Germany is a leading actor in the big decentralization reform, but also in Georgia, when it comes to rule of law, infrastructure projects, and so on. That means actually it is engaged very committed to these processes in countries which are seen by Russia as countries who left the sphere, or who try to leave the sphere of influence of Russia. At the same time, Germany views itself as a centralized, not as a central or centralist, as a centralized power in Europe, which means that Germany tries to maintain good relations as well as to the Western countries, the foundation countries of European Union in the West, as well as the countries in the East. Germany would never, and that is even sometimes a problem when it comes to overstretched expectations to its new role after the United States do support more distance to Europe, but Germany would never take initiatives on its own. It will, and that is a premise of its policy. It tries to coordinate and agree every bigger initiative in foreign policy with its partners within the European Union. Germany actually sees its strength in good relations with different macro regions and different geopolitical interests within Europe. So Germany is very engaged not only in the Eastern Partnership process, but also in the new approaches in southern neighborhood when it comes to the Maghreb states, as you see it at the moment towards in the context of the Germany's head in European Union now. So all these premises worked quite well in the 90s and in the beginning of the 2000s, when the rule-based order really worked, when we had the first successes with the enlargement in Europe, when Russia still was not assertive, and when and as long as third powers like China or key states like Iran and other states did still not challenge these rule-based rule-based order, at least in Europe. Concerning Russia, these premises meant, at least in the first time after the fall of Soviet Union, that Germany, from the point of view of the government, has to support constructive relations to Russia, but at the same time, it had to take into account the security needs of those states in Eastern and East Central Europe, which still did not become a part or a member of NATO or European Union. Again, all that was successful for a certain time. But it was challenged, let me say, at latest from the Russian side with the annexation of Crimea. And Germany had, or let me say, the German foreign policy needed quite a long time to modify its policies towards Russia, even after the annexation of Crimea. Please note, and here you have already the contradictions within the German foreign policy. Please note that even after the Russian aggression against Georgia, Germany still upheld the so-called modernization project with Russia. So it was a project which argued that Russia could be contained by more and more economic interdependence. So that did not mean that everything was understood by Russlandversteher, yes, what happened in Russia, but it was a hope that a deeper interconnection with Russia and Europe could force Russia also to compromise. And that already failed in 2008, in my view. There are other views in Germany. Actually, Russia used the approach of selective engagement with Russia to prevent Germany from taking a different position to Russia, a more serious, a more, also when it comes to sanctions, position to Russia foreign policy. Please note that the first project of Nord Stream, so the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, was actually projected after the aggression of Georgia, when the oil and gas prices in the world market were very high, and the Russians very sophisticatedly included Germany, which sharply criticized that aggression. Again, Germany is very engaged in Georgia, but the Russians managed to explain the Germans that for a better energy supply and stability, it would be very useful to have Nord Stream 1, which already created big problems for the transit role of Ukraine at that time. But at that time, Ukraine was still not so strong on the horizon of Germany's foreign policy. And by the way, the same is true for Nord Stream 2. The main period of negotiations of Nord Stream 2 actually came into being after the annexation of Crimea and the high peak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the so-called Battle of Debaltseve. After that, we had the Petersburg Economic Forum, where the main, the main points of Nord Stream 2 were agreed. So the Russian strategy was actually, so when it comes to the aims of Verflechtung and modernization, so interconnecting policy, Russia actually used a modernization partnership for a selective engagement without a common basis of rules of cooperation. And that was the great mistake of Germany. And here it comes already to policy of influence of Russia. Who are the groups in Germany which were interested in that? And that is, of course, I think very important. You have some key persons in actually the German, let me say, lobby groups of economy, the so-called Eastern European chambers of trade and economy, which are actually support good relations to Russia. Which are not by its nature simply pro-Russian, but these people and representatives, they argue in very selective bilateral economic dimensions. And of course, at the same time, they are in a deep discourse with the Russian economy. And that also promoted a campaign in Germany that Nord Stream 2 is a simply and purely economic bilateral project and has nothing to do with security. What is important that you have here some key persons who have very good relationships to Kremlin, like, for example, what is very important in the gas negotiations, Mr. Martin Warnig, a former Stasi officer who was in good terms with Mr. Putin already in Dresden in the 80s. So you have even direct friendly relations between economic lobbyist groups and the Kremlin, and personally with Putin, who managed, for example, and that is very sophisticated. It is not that is not purely propaganda. Who managed by the use of economic institutes, economic science, to argue that for example, Ukrainian pipeline is highly unmodernized, has to be updated, is very risky, is not solid. And so Germany needs an alternative, stable gas pipeline, and also Europe needs it in order to, and that is also very tricky, in also to preserve energy supply and use of gas as a bridge energy supply to manage also the climate change. Yes, so you have, and these people sometimes, of course, they have a clear pro-Russian Kremlin agenda on the one hand, but very much of them are still only economic experts. And it was, of course, very easy to argue in favor of a modern pipeline when Ukraine still did not step in very engaged in the reform process. What is now we have another picture. Yes, we have the best reforms in Ukraine, we have in the energy field, and what is very tragic for Ukraine, that actually in that field where Ukraine can make money for the first time, and where you have now a solid energy supplier like Naftogaz, they are the very best firm when it comes to tax paying. Yes, I mean, they are the biggest taxpayer in Ukraine, so they make really money with the gas transit. Actually, in that time, Germany is negotiating Nord Stream pipeline 2, and with the risk to that Ukraine will lose a very important transit function in Europe. And of course, that has a security background. And as we all know, Russia is using the gas supply with Gazprom as a very special form of soft power to soft power, maybe a little bit with irony, soft power to use to preserve its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. But here you already see how certain people and pressure groups manage to influence. And that is also very important for the German foreign policy. It is highly ambivalent, actually, when it comes to Russia. So what I said concerning the rule-based order, of course, is very important for Angela Merkel. If you want to understand why Merkel is so engaged in the settlement of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, it is actually because Merkel and a part of German government is really recognizing the importance of keeping the rule-based order more or less functioning. That is really the case. On the other hand, Germany showed in the last years that it is not so solidaric when it comes to egoist economic interest, because the main problem for me with Nord Stream 2 is simply the fact that Nord Stream was not agreed within the European Union with the East Central European neighbors and also with France, for example, which had very big doubts on the project because of security arguments. And thus, Germany contributed to bring more cleavages into European solidarity, what is actually an aim of Russia. And what you see here from my work, it's very complicated, because it is really complicated to understand why a government, which is the number one when it comes to held up the sanctions against Russia. I mean, Germany here is a very solid partner of Ukraine. Germany is quite close to Ukraine when it comes to security issues in the Minsk process. Germany never would allow to make a deal between Russia and Ukraine when it really will harm the Ukrainian sovereignty on the one hand, but on the other hand, having the illusion of a selective engagement with Russia that is possible to have a selective engagement with Russia without any value-based or interest-based basis of cooperation, Germany neutralizes its role as a gatekeeper of European Union and the main rules which keep European Union together. And I think that is connected at first with a difficult political, let me say, constellation in the Great Coalition in Berlin. So you have a coalition with very different views on security issues, on Russia, within the government. A part of Social Democrats is more, let me say, inclined to make compromises to Russia. There are also, for example, civil society connections like the German-Russian Forum that is, let me say, Russian-friendly civil society platform, where you have people like Mr. Yakunin, the head of the Institute of Civilizations, who is a channel of widespreading the ideology of Russian world in Germany on the one hand, and you have Mr. Platzek, a former Premier Minister of the land Brandenburg, who is the head of that network and who is arguing, and that is also very interesting, that we have, as Germans, we have a special obligation at the background to history towards Russia. Yes, we cannot, as Germans who attacked Russia 70 years ago, we cannot now be the main, let me say, we cannot confirm, or we cannot promote further confrontation with Russia. That are the Russian understanders by soul, yes? But there are also very cynical people who simply for functionalist reasons and want to have a more, let me say, balanced policy to Russia. And that is the attitude of many Germans and and in the part of the German establishment, the attitude to the United States. If you want to understand the ambivalent attitude of Germans to Russia, you will understand time by time that it is sometimes only a reflection of their attitudes to the United States. So there is, for example, the conception, or the let me say, there is the argument that if Europe would reach more strategic autonomy, we have to come into good terms with Russia, because we cannot anymore base our security needs on the close transatlantic European partnership. Secondly, if we want to face the challenge with China, we also need a stronger Russia, because China is much, in their view, yes, China is much stronger than Russia, and China, like Macron, that is a Macron direction of thinking, but it is also a little bit widespread in Germany. We will not manage the challenge which comes from the Belt and Road Initiative from China, and which now already has a big impact on the economy issues in Eastern Europe. So that is one thing. The other thing is, and that is, let me say, a certain division in Germany between Eastern Germany and Western Germany. In Eastern Germany, actually, in the last time when we had all this discussion about the attempted poisoning of Mr. Navalny, about the cyber attacks which were already earlier in 2015 or 16 against the German parliament, when it comes to the murder of a Chechen guy in the Berliner Park Tiergarten by a Russian, you know that there are already investigations, and I think that is already very well shown that behind that at least is a Russian citizen. Then you see that the premier ministers of the eastern lands, they criticize the sanctions because they say it very harms the economic relations of the eastern federal lands, because they seem to be dependent on Russian relations, what I think is not true. And by the way, it is very interesting that they do not discuss how they can promote, even more promote, better relations to Czech Republic, to Poland, for example. Yes, that is not discussed at all. For me, very interesting. So that is one thing, and the other thing is that you have, of course, an electorate, so many voters who have still pro-Russian feelings, and who are even more inclined by historical issues like the Great Fatherland War, that Russia liberated actually the Eastern Germany from fascism. That all creates, let me say, a certain ground that these premier ministers are of the opinion that they need to keep into account the interest of their voters who are more or less pro-Russian inclined. Although that is also not so true, I think another factor is the upcoming of the alternative of Germany, so a party on the right wing, on the very right wing, which stands in the tradition of the new right, which was formed in the 60s and had direct ties to the so-called conservative revolution between the world wars. And here you have also a quite strong pro-Russian influence, not only to make use of it in functionalist terms, because of course they try to make use of Putin's Russia as a projection screen for their so-called traditional German values. Yes, they see Putin as a protector of a traditionalist, authoritarian not feminist, not homosexual, but traditional, but standing up for traditional family ties. So for a power which keeps their viewing of Europe. And but you have also direct ties by content, because, and that is, for example, you mentioned my studies on Sudeto Germans. You have to understand that one of the main catalysts of the new right in Germany, which came up in the 60s, were the successors and the successor organization of the cradles of the Heinlein movement between the world wars. And 2 or 3 guys who are the most outstanding right-wing extremists in that party, they also got their socialization in these organizations, which were the successors of the conservative revolutionists between the world wars, and who were the inspirators of the Sudeto German movement. What is very interesting, and they share Putin's view on Europe. That is to say, there is a Russian world, so a big, great Russian civilization, and there is a Roman German civilization, and they should make a deal. They should make a deal and guarantee stability in Europe, of course, not taking into the account what is the interest of the so-called, it is only the so-called, yes, the so-called little nations, yes? So the Ukrainians, who did not realize that they are a natural part of the great Russian world, or other Poles, yes, but also the Czechs. So it is you see here, you have now a party in German Bundestag which has direct ties to the Eurasian movements, to the outlets of Russian world, who are using the increasing media outlets of Russia Today, Ruptly News, or Sputnik News, in order to widespread their messages actually into the households in Eastern Germany, and also into the households of those Germans who came after the fall of Soviet Union, who belonged to the German minority in Soviet Union, and who now also have, let me say, some sensibilities for the chauvinist and traditionalist discourse of Russian world. When you, for example, look at the so-called Lisa case, which took place in Berlin in 2016, when the girl Lisa, as it was said by Mr. Lavrov, was attacked by a Syrian migrant, as he said. You had demonstrations actually of right-wing parties like AfD, but also of those organizations who are representing the Vertriebenen in Germany. So also those who were forced to migrate from Czech Republic, Poland, and so on, and their successors. And traditionally, they are very on the right side of the political spectrum. And they also, that was very clear, they are, let me say, the propaganda is addressed to them in order to further establish a channel to step into German society. Although I have to say, of course, that is absolutely not representative for the people who came from Soviet Union. They are very different. They are, by social and economic and political terms, as different as the Germans at all. But you have a part within these, let me say not minority, but a part within that special part of Germans who feel today that they are not respected quite well. Yes, and they also have in Putin a projection for a man who is really caring for the Russians. But what is Merkel doing? She is caring about the people who are coming from Syria, but they are not caring in Berlin about us. We, who are the, let me say, the representatives of truthful German values. Yes, and that is actually also a piano where Russian medias can play on. And you should also take into account that there is a new tactics in my view, because the Lisa case and how Lavrov intervened in Germany had also a boomerang effect. Actually, social democrats who are more leftist when it comes to society, to liberal values. Yes, they very criticized the Lavrov's intervention. Lavrov, as you know, he made official statements. The German police is not working quite well, and so on. That was something what has a very negative effect, actually, on those who earlier were very friendly to the Russians. But what is important, that I think they changed a little bit the tactics. Now what I see in my research is that the so-called compatriot policy, so the policies which is created by the Russian foreign ministry and says to protect Russians or Russian speakers abroad. Yes, you have also very much Russian speakers in Germany. They also try now to be engaged in fields which are not so political, which are not so connected with big questions of economy and policy. But because you see now these networks being engaged in education, yes, in parents' organizations who have the oversight in schools. So there is another tactics, and they are organizing, for example, Pushkin evenings, Tolstoy evenings, yes, also with very interesting ties to AfD party and to, let me say, organizations who are very near politically to the AfD. And and everything is very sophisticated, because when you have such an evening, you also have the Russian ambassador or people from Russian embassy there. And they, for example, announce then a very successful concert in Crimea. Yes. So you have also they use the cultural and educational channel to focus on issues which are highly political, but they do it in a very everyday-like manner. Yes, and that is something I think we have to observe very much. Okay, to conclude, what I think is, and you can then take questions. I maybe will now a little bit summarize that. Germany's modernization partnership, in my view, failed because you cannot have a special relationship and you cannot have selective engagement without a common basis of rules and values for cooperation, also without a common aims, what you really want to implement. That is also a problem. I mean, Russia's policy, even also towards Germany as a very important partner, is quite destructive. Yes, that is also a problem. What is our common aim with Russia? You have to define it. Yes, Germany should diminish its dependencies on Russia when it comes to energy resources. Selective cooperation with Russia can only work if Germany is a relevant player in such issues. Yes, only if Germany really has an influence in common projects, you can risk to cooperate with Russia in them. That also means, for example, why is it so tragic for Germany? Because Germany, I said, is a centralized power. That means that Germany is very engaged in conflict settlement. Syria, Libya, Ukraine, in all these conflicts, you cannot reach any solution without Russia. Yes, and that is actually the problem. If you have no leverage in the not cooperation, but in the negotiation with Russia in these fields, you will every time be the number two and not the number one. That is a problem. So what you have to do, and that is also a problem, you should not only think about how to follow up, how to implement new sanctions against Russia. Yes, that is not a policy. To make only sanctions, that is a Euridification of foreign policy, and that is not foreign policy. It is a little bit more complicated. You have to perform in key neighborhoods of European Union in another way. So you have to establish a presence by projects of connectivity. Yes. I give you one example. Germany is very engaged in infrastructure in Georgia, which is very crucial now if you look at the issues in the Southern Caucasus, yes, where Europe was simply out. Yes, Europe was played out. The Americans were far away, and in a key region of European neighborhood, which is a bridge for the future trade between Asia and Europe, we are simply out. Although Germany has quite big assets, because Germany and European Union already promised, for example, the implementation of a deep sea port in Georgia, which has great economic importance. But for problems of bad governance, Russian influence in Georgia, which is also growing again, and the misunderstanding that that is not only a technical project, but a strategic project in order to establish independent trade routes between Europe and Eastern Europe and the Caspian region, we and the European Union did not to a sufficient extent control what is going on with the project. And now the government under the Cree Cardinal of Mr. Bishanivili, they already stopped the project, and Russia is now building a similar deep sea port with, by the way, also with military strategic importance in the Taman island at the opposite of Crimea, yes, and will control again the trade, which is now already controlling by the port of Novorossiysk. I can number up much more of these examples. So European Union and Germany and France should understand that you really have to protect international law. You have to protect sea law. You should bring cases like the military exercise in Black Sea, where Russia is violating international law by closing zones of seawater. Yes, they simply closed 25% of the Black Sea and say we are making exercises, not taking into account the mechanisms which are agreed by the international community. All these things are not mentioned. And what is happening, Russia is making, let me say, a creeping occupation in our neighborhoods, not by making every time a military escalation, but they use the absence of our intention in order to, by creeping manners, to establish very, very advantaged positions. And then you already have no leverage when it comes to a conflict, because the Russians are already there. And I do not speak about Eurasia. I do not speak about Ukraine. I speak about seas and zones which are even partly integral part of European Union. That is a problem. Germany is aware that it should be it should be more done actually when it comes to protect the rule-based order in Eastern Europe. But the things are in a flow. And the problem is that the expectations in Eastern Europe are very high. And Germany has also other things to do now. It has to manage the Corona crisis, the consequences of the Corona crisis also in Europe. And let me say it so, everything is in a flow, and Germany still did not find its role. How to satisfy the expectations of their partners within the European Union and without the European Union.
Jiří Schneider is asking about the new generation of politicians in Germany and who don't remember the World War II, etc., don't have this baggage. What to expect there, and with regards relations on German foreign policy with Russia?
I think what is very positive actually on the more left side of the political spectrum, that even also in the young social democrats, there is also a tendency more to recognize what is happening within Russia. I mean, these people are quite, so they see Russia in a quite critical way when it comes to the rights of minorities, of sexual minorities, of national minorities. So the model of Russia and how Putin is behaving now, also with that constitutional reform, has, I would say, rather negative effects from the Russian point of view for the future relations than good effects. Yes, because they are actually really for a more liberal and reformist understanding of society. On the other hand, I would say that we also should be clear that, for example, the party of AfD, these people are not only old veterans, yes, who have still some connections to the old Bundesrepublik far right. No, there are also young people who try to use, for example, the Russian vector in order to make political capital of that. I mean, you have younger people in AfD who are simply directly connected with the Kremlin. For example, Mr. Frohnmeier, yes, who maybe got even instructions by people within the Kremlin. So you have, to a much more lesser extent, you have also some reproduction of far-right politicians, and we should observe that. Although I think at the moment, let me say, the high noon of that party is a little bit declining, yes, because they have no answers to climate change, no answers to coronavirus. People see that they have absolutely no skills in political management. They do not approach to real political problems, and that also all these focuses also reduce the role of Russia, because all these problems we have, and now that is more obvious for the Germans, we need not Russia to solve the problem with climate change, to reform industries. So the Russian model does not help us at all for solving our real problems. That has also an impact on the younger generations. I mean, Die Linke is really a problem because of a very anti-American approach. They have also direct, like the AfD, some people of them have direct connection, for example, to the so-called republics in the Donbass, also to Eurasian networks of Mr. Dugin. They have also that very interesting anti-oligarchic picture of Europe, which is also has something in common with the Russian propaganda, although the Russian system is simply based on oligarchic system, yes? But that obviously does not play any role. But even in the Linke, although they never would stand up for sanctions, for more security, they would not pay any more for security, as they want to step out of NATO. But there is also a part of serious parliamentarians or of the younger generation, which already have not so much to do with the old GDR, who are also very skeptically looking at what is going on within Russia. That is also interesting. CDU, also very important. Traditionally, CDU is, let me say, the defender of transatlantic European relations, but that is also not quite true. You have also in CDU people who are quite engaged in realizing Nord Stream 2, who think that Ukraine is not our first problem. You actually have very pragmatic thinking about Russia in the CSU, so your neighbor, your Bavarian neighbor. CSU is very open, was still open to engage in economic and cultural projects between Bavaria and Moscow after the annexation of Crimea, actually Mr. Seehofer. And also the Social Democrats, it's not so easy, I want to tell you, because yes, the Social Democrats, they are more inclined to avoid any confrontation. But what is very important, a great part of their, let me say, politicians and parliamentarians who are responsible for foreign and security policy, they are very solid defenders of NATO membership, and actually European Union. What is very important to understand, Social Democrats in their overwhelming majority, even when it comes to the young socialists on the outermost left, they never would give up European Union as an important liberal and political project, what is actually not in the interest of the outlets of Russian influence in Germany. So leadership of the Greens, of course, they are against Nord Stream for climate change. They are very critical to Russia for human rights and all that. That is very clear. And they are actually propagating a new approach in the policy towards Russia. But the basis of the Greens is very leftist, is very pacifist. So it will be very difficult to explain changes in the program when it comes to more security responsibility of Germany. It will be very difficult to explain the need of that to a wider part of the members of the Green Party. So you have at the moment a not so easy picture in Germany.
What is now going to happen with the new Biden administration?
I think there are big hopes in Germany. You see it already in opinion polls that the attitude to America, to US already has changed in the last weeks, because I think the Germans really hope that Biden can be a better partner of Germany, and I think that really can change the relationship. We also should take into account, yes, we have a critical part of German society towards America, but we have also the other part, a very traditional pro-transatlantic part. You should not forget that. So it is also not so easy, and I think the hopes to be in partnership rather with the US than with Russia or China in economic terms will grow. But everything, of course, will depend how what is Germany investing in that, yes? And you already heard all the statements also of Mr. Maas. Yes, they are very positive. They are very happy that we have maybe now the return to multilateralism. But my problem is that I do not see that Germany really tries to establish a new strategy actually when it comes to Eastern Europe. I do not see at the moment, I see at the moment very difficult discussions ahead when it comes to the fulfillment of the 2% norm, which was decided on the NATO summit in Wales in 2014. So the problem is we have much hopes, but I think there is still not the understanding that maybe Mr. Biden is a less classical transatlantic president of the United States, because even if his vice president will become president, that is also another generation of America. For them, the Pacific Asian region is much more important than Ukraine or Black Sea. So the problem is there is now a window of opportunity. But that requires that Germany takes its responsibility and tries to convince the European partners that the European Union should, within NATO, take a greater share of security and also wider security. I do not speak only about military. I also speak about simply diplomatic, coherent, and sustainable engagement. in our key neighborhoods from the Near East to the Caspian to the classical Eastern Europe like Belarus. Yes, and what here? So what? I hope that will be not only an illusion, because Biden and some people in Germany, of course, understand that quite well. Biden also will be very strong when it comes to a new share of responsibilities within NATO, and I think that will be very hard to explain German society.
Would you agree that Energiewende is basically a dangerous door opener for Russia to get more influence?
That is very difficult because so I mean, different actors in Germany, when it comes to climate change, argue in a different way. The Greens, for example, in parliament, they are very convinced that gas cannot provide a bridge to the future, because at first we have also big problems with air pollution when it comes to the gas production in Siberia, for example. Yes, the methane air pollution is a very serious problem. No one knows about that, but it's a serious problem. So it is for the Greens not a clean energy supply. Secondly, the Greens argue if we will fill Nord Stream 2 to the limit of its capacity, then we will never replace these energy supplies by alternative energy supplies, because it creates then its own market. Yes, even if you don't need it, but when you have it, okay, you get it, you have it, and you can use it. My problem with all that discussion about gas is that there is one argument deep in the background, and that is the argument number one for me. We have a good pipeline. We have it in Ukraine. We have a pipeline we have a pipeline like a big railway route, yes, because the Ukrainians they have not only one pipeline, they have more pipelines in one direction. Even if one pipeline is being repaired, you can use the other one. It is a fascinating pipeline system the Ukrainians have, and for me there was never a need to build Nord Stream 2, because you have the capacities you now are building in Nord Stream, building up in Nord Stream 2. You have it already in Ukraine.
What about the sanctions? The sanctions were imposed after annexation of Crimea. It doesn't look like that Russia will soon give it up. From my understanding, as long as Angela Merkel is in a chancellor in Germany, then the sanctions will not be lifted. At least the Germans will not want, or the German government will not be lifting them or changing them. What happens after she is gone?
That is a good question, and of course it depends. At first, for example, who will be the candidate of CDU, because CDU at the moment is the party with the most perspective to have the candidate for chancellor. And if you have a look on these candidates, Mr. Laschet, who is a premier minister in North Rhine-Westphalia, the biggest, and not the biggest, Bavaria is the biggest, but concerning population, the biggest federal land in Germany. Laschet is quite neutral to the sanctions, and he's also, from his character, a person who is very inclined to compromise, who doesn't like any confrontation, who is more compromised to Russia. What does not mean Laschet is absolutely sure when it comes to NATO, to European Union in general, but when it comes to these questions, I think he could be a person who is open for compromise with Russia, for example. To cut down the sanctions in different pieces. Yes, so if the Russians make a little compromise in prisoner exchange, we already will lift a part of the sanctions. What does not make sense, because the sanctions, the sectoral economic sanctions against Russia, make only sense if you have them as a whole, not as pieces cut down. So that is one thing. Mr. Merz, who is a classical transatlantic politician in CDU, I think He is ambivalent on Nord Stream 2, but for example, in Nord Stream 2, he says we need a moratorium as long as Russia is not acting in the case of Navalny. That is already some position in between. And I think he is not the person who will really work on the lifting of sanctions as soon as Russia did not really show up in the Minsk process. I think with Merz it is sure. With Röttgen, who is the head of the Committee of Foreign Policy, he is the most strategic when it comes to foreign policy. He's the most critical when it comes to relations to China, Russia, and Syria, for example. He also wanted to implement sanctions against Russia when it comes to Syria and the destructions of civil buildings in Syria. He was one of the persons who very loudly so with Röttgen also nothing will change. Röttgen even will be more engaged in a more profiled role in security of Germany, profiled role in uphold the interests of our Eastern European neighborhood, and more profiled to keep human rights and international law. So he has really a foreign policy agenda, but he has no basis, I think, no quite big basis in CDU. He will have a good result, but I think he won't win. Yeah. So that is with the Social Democrats, it is also difficult when they go in a coalition with the Linke. Then it could be a compromise to lift the sanction, but not to leave NATO or something like that. I don't know. But we can then not be sure. Although it also depends what is the position of the Chancellor candidate, Mr. Scholz, in a future coalition, because Scholz, of course, belongs to those Social Democrats who are quite solid when it comes to NATO and European Union. So it is not given for sure that a left coalition will lift the sanctions, but there is a danger. And we cannot exclude such a coalition because at the moment there is speaks much for the result that maybe there will be a coalition black-green, so conservatives and the Greens. Then I think everything will not change in that direction. But you absolutely do not know what happens with CDU in a year, because they have big problems with that competition within the party. Is a big problem.
It's been very informative. Thank you very much. We will still continue to be watching what's happening in Germany as our most important and largest neighbor.
Thank you so much.